We want to keep this afternoon on as good a time schedule as we can. We know the weather's cold and a lot of you want to get home this evening before it gets too late. We do appreciate the panel that we've got up here this afternoon to talk about some of the research and the beef technology that's going on in the state of Missouri. It's amazing to me that we have such a great team of research folks in the beef industry in our state, especially here at the University of Missouri. As I have them on the agenda, unless they change it, we'll start off with Dr. Monty Curley, followed by Mike Caston, Justin Sexton, then Ed Lehman with Summit Livestock, Kurt Beckman with the Department of Natural Resources, and we'll end up with Dr. Jerry Taylor. So their information is in your handouts and in your folders as far as their background and their education. I encourage you to listen closely and have lots of questions. We've got about an hour to work through these discussions and the questions. So let's give them their attention and thank you all very much. Let's give them a hand.
Good job. Brian, can you hear me? Can you hear me, Brian? All right, Mark can hear me. The first thing I want to do is Governor Nixon talked or introduced Daryl Chapman today, and he said he had a degree in ag economics. That's not really the greatest thing Daryl's done. He has a degree in animal sciences. That's the greatest thing that Daryl has done. And I could talk about the character of him as a man. I could talk about his intellectual ability, all those accomplishments. The thing that I was most impressed with Daryl is when I was a couple of years younger, we had a crew that went over and played basketball at lunch, and Daryl would go over there. I always prided myself because I played forward, and nobody drove the basket when I played forward. If you saw Daryl when he stood up, he was the linebacker for the Tigers. Daryl never knew I was there. Some of the things I want to cover real quick is the research. Allison Meyer is in our group. She's here in the audience, and Justin. And we do beef nutrition research, and I want to talk about some of the specific things we're doing there and how we think they can apply to beef production here in the state. A lot of this, the research, we've had several meetings with Director Fordyce and some of the people in his group. We've got good direction and interaction with Department of Ag, and we've also, Jim, I don't know how many times I've bent Jim McCann's ear running some of these things off of him and getting his input back, but through that on the cattlemen's as well. One of the things we've worked for several years on has been diet formulation, and there's a couple of reasons for that. I think it was Joe Parcell talked about the importance of feed efficiency. What we like to say is if you think about golf, you drive for show and you putt for dough. Feed efficiency is putting and cattle feeding, and so that's we spend a lot of time on that. We think we have some new ways to approach diet formulations. If we have a group of calves on feed and we don't have a shot at over 4 pounds a day gain and under 4 pounds of feed per pound of gain conversion, we don't think we've done something right. Now, what that translates into is right now we should be well under 45 cents feed cost of gain. And I think we're going to have to think about that if we're going to be profitable or sustainable in beef production. The other thing we do in that is we take roughage out of diets once they go on to grain. And in doing that, we've reduced the amount of manure output by 40%. So I think your comment earlier about waste management, if you go to these hoop structures, and really the trick there is keeping the bedding in those facilities. It really is amazing what you can do in terms of waste reduction, and then what you can do in waste management. Residual feed intake, we've worked on that for several years, and what that really is a measure, or how I like to think about it, is metabolic efficiency. Our interest in that has been how do we take calves, select or identify ones that are more efficient from how they use energy, and then propagate that. If we take F1 animals, we can improve their feed efficiency 10 or 14% just by the bull we use, if that bull is truly feed efficient. There's a producer in Wyoming that's done this for some years. If you look at the average of his calves, his cattle are going to need 85% of the feed that the average population needs. His outliers are around 68%. We don't know how far we're going to push this, But the point is, we can get these calves to do things through diet formulation and selection that I don't care how seasoned you are in the beef industry, you would never think these they would be possible. What we're doing, our group, is we're on the nutrition, diet balancing end. We're making progress, and whenever we see gene markers come about, I would lay all the money I've got that Jerry Taylor, who's on the panel, going to talk in a minute, his lab will lead some of those markers we use, and how as producers, you're going to implement them in productions you make. So anyway, big deal on feed efficiency and diet formulation. A plug for Missouri, if you know Kent Abley at Green Springs Bull Test. Kent had the first facility in the country, first commercial bull test in the country, where they were measuring feed intake for commercial bull producers. And then I think I saw Mark, and I don't know if Nick's in here or not, but Circle A has been doing that for, somebody help me out, how many years? Circle A had to go home and break waters, I guess, after 15 or whatever it was. But then we also have a breeder in the state, and then other people have been doing that. So Missouri, I think, can really brag about that aspect. We've done some work with real-time body weight with the same company that makes the feed intake instruments. The body weight can go out in a pasture. You can use it in a pen of cattle. If you had the ability to know the exact point that a calf was going to be at a body weight that maximized your market endpoint, would that have value? And they can do it. The other thing, and I'll put a plug in, John he's what the heck is that technology? And then John saw it, and John may be the first purchaser of it in the state of Missouri. Also has things in terms of sickness ID. If you have intake behavior of that calf, you're going to know when that calf is sick at least 24 hours before the best set of eyes is going to know it. What's more important, some of the work that's coming out in that, is that about a third of those calves that you ID as sick is actually sick. So not to hack off the pharmaceutical folks, but if I could reduce antibiotic administration by 2/3, would that have value? Without question. All things that are coming down the pike. Last thing is Rob Kallenbach. I've seen him somewhere in the audience today. Rob's lab has come up with a test where if you get them some DNA from a calf, he can tell you where that animal ranks in terms of fescue tolerance. And Rob, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the outcome of that is if you have a cow that's tolerant to fescue versus one that isn't, that's about 50 pounds of weaning weight that cow's going to produce just because she has some tolerance to fescue. So Rob's in the process of trying to get that where it can be commercialized and all the things involved with that. A couple of personal notes, and I'll pass it on, is one of the favorite things I like to argue about, and if you're in the state of Missouri, you have a lot of people that want to argue about this, but we can feed cattle as well as any place in the country. It's interesting to me that I've had 3 or 4 folks that I do some stuff with, and they may buy X thousand head of cattle per year, and they'll feed some fraction of those cattle in their own place, and they'll always say year in and year out, I make more money in the cattle I feed than all the ones I own someplace else. So anyway, if you have nothing better to do, I would love to argue with you if you don't think we can feed cattle in the state of Missouri. Final thing, and I guess goes back, Mike Deering asked the question about the packing plants and what have you, and how Brian could be helped. One of the things I hope that comes out of this beef summit is, and Mike, maybe this is a throw out to you, but is how the research we do at the university is integrated more to the producers, and even more importantly, feedback from producers to us in terms of what things are important. So I would just add that, whether they're Jim, where the Cattleman's is the conduit for that or whatever. But let's use this summit and give some brain time to thinking about how we make that integration better than what it is now. Not saying we haven't had some successes.
I'm Mike Caston. I come at this kind of, as we talked about how we're going to go in the future and what direction we're going to go in the future from a cow-calf standpoint, heading up the Quality Beef by the Numbers program. And I kind of started thinking, we kind of need to remember our history here as we talk about this. You know, since the mid-'70s to the late to mid-'90s, in the name of making cattle bigger and all that we needed to do, we did a tremendous, very efficient job of breeding the quality out of the United States beef herd. We did a really good job of that. So whatever we do in the future, the United States place in the world is going to be quality, because the rest of the world is not holding still, waiting for us to stay where we are. And we are certainly perched very well in Missouri. When you see the data that over 10% around of all the CAB in the United States has its origin in Missouri. When you look at U.S. Premium Beef said the largest concentration of prime cattle by far comes from Missouri, and everywhere else it's distributed equally. We stand out in those categories. We stand out in the seed stock production in those qualities, and we've done a really good job at that. And we are not going to get more resources to the cow-calf industry. So where do we make more money? And to me, that's we create more value with the resources we have right now. We create more value by creating a product that has more value. We have the ability to do that because starting in the early 90s with Farmland Supreme Beef Program, which went out of business, which was the precursor to U.S. Premium Beef, we basically went from a socialistic pricing system for beef to a system where we can get paid for the value of our product. And we know that value comes from genetics, because in that 20-year span, we said we can take anything, throw it into a feedlot, and make it all equal. And we know that that's not true. We know we have to have the genetic quality bred into those animals, regardless of which market you try to hit, to find the genetics that meets that market and make more of them. And one of the interesting things that I've seen as we do the quality beef program, and Dr. Brown said this quickly this morning, in a pen of cattle we thought we sent to the feed yard that was relatively uniform, we have $1,000 difference in value at the end product, and up to $800 difference in net profit within that pen of cattle. One of the things we're not doing well as an industry is finding those cattle that are on the top end and the bottom end. And we, as I work with commercial cattle producers, I hear a lot of apologies. Well, I don't have a good record system. I'm sorry I don't have a record system. We need to be finding them. If we're going to add value, a very simple and easy way for us to do that in the cow-calf industry in Missouri is find the top cattle and make more of them, and find the bottom cattle and let some other state own them. We can send those out of state. I don't care how you're going to market. Let's find them, and we do that in a number of ways, and we're going to do that genetically and targeting our genetics for an end product that hits the market that we're trying to do. And we only do that by some form of record keeping back to cattle producers. Because I know if we have cattle that phenotypically express things that are desirable and make more money, and we take that data to Jerry and say, find out in the genome what made that happen, we have just created a huge tool to jump forward. And we in Missouri enjoy the fact that we have the best genetics team in the country. We have a repro team that's developed a technology that gives us the ability to infuse those genetics into our herd more efficiently than we ever had before. Our challenge to me is this cow-calf industry take this technology. We're not using those technologies to near the advantage we need to be using them as a whole, and we need to be doing that. And I would say if we can find some way out of some to get producers to engage in the use of those technologies more, we can take a tremendous amount more value to the cattle produced in Missouri, and we can own them. We can sell them to somebody else who wants to own them. And I do take a little exception to Kansas claiming my money. I have retained ownership for years, and I sold cattle that averaged over $2,000 a head, and they never owned them at all. And so that was Missouri dollars, and Kansas claimed it as their income. And that is true in the feed yard we feed in, and they don't own a single animal in their feed yard. So every animal in that feed yard was owned by somebody not in that state, and Kansas took credit for the value of what they sold. So there are a lot of ways for us to get that value, but it's initially going to start right here with we as cow-calf seed stock producers finding a way to put the genetics in there to sell a high-quality product, regardless of which way you want to market it.
Hello, My name's Justin Sexton. I'm a state beef extension specialist for nutrition. I get the privilege to work with Dr. Curley on a regular basis, and Dr. Meyer as well. Some of our students are here as well. Many of you I've gotten to know as I travel around the state, putting on producer education. And so the biggest thing that I'm going to try to touch on from a technology standpoint that Dr. Curley did not is as it relates to forage management or forage utilization, and that a lot of my work is in background in cattle or stocker cattle. And probably the greatest technology that's being underutilized as it is today is the use of novel endophytes to address fescue toxicosis. It was mentioned earlier that we've had a tremendous amount of pasture conversion to row crop land, and some of those systems worked well when corn was $7, and now that corn is not $7, those acres may be better suited to pasture. And so one of the limitations of using a novel endophyte fescue that doesn't cause fescue toxicosis and still persists has been the transformation of those acres into that new variety. And so just kind of an example, if you think about the row crop industry, how many of you would plant the same corn variety that was developed 50 years ago? I didn't think I'd see any hands. Yet we would continue to plant the same grass that we would year after year. And we have technology available that allows that forage to persist and improve average daily gain. Cows conceive better, and Justin, they don't have that rough hair coat that when they come to the livestock market get discounted for looking like fescue cattle. And so my point there is fescue toxicosis is a real problem that we all deal with based off of our forage base. And so converting to those novel endophytes is one opportunity that I see that's completely underutilized. And as kind of related to my question earlier, land is a significant barrier to entry from a young producer standpoint. I am a beef nutritionist, but I'm also a cattle entrepreneur, and I'm not a land baron, as I indicated. And so any additional production out of an acre of ground I can get, I'm interested in. And so supplementation models that we've developed increase carrying capacity and the gain per acre. And so looking at supplement systems, it doesn't have to be a confined cattle model. It can certainly be something where we feed cattle and replace the grass or save grass, get more productivity per unit of land. And if we implement those novel endophytes, suddenly we can use nitrogen fertilizer again. We can't fertilize tall fescue pastures because it increases fescue toxicosis. And so it's certainly not a new technology. I joke with my agronomist friends that they continue to be amazed that nitrogen fertilizer makes grass grow. Okay? But if we have a limited amount of land and we can replace that forage that is more productive and causes less problems with toxicosis, that's an opportunity that I see to increase productivity per unit of land area. As we think about opportunities to economically retain ownership in the state, I think if I was to put together a perfect system, none of them would look the same. In that I think the opportunity Missouri has is a flexible cattle feeding system. May work in a backgrounding model from 400 pounds to 700 pounds for one person on grass. The other may be buying 6-weight heifers, putting them in the feed yard, and retaining them up until 850 and selling them. And so as a technology, I think the capacity to sort those systems gives us an advantage in that you have multiple marketing opportunities. I think if I would suggest that to develop a recipe that everyone uses, I think would be a mistake from a feeding cattle in Missouri, and that lays in our other advantages in that we have the opportunity to get cattle from any place in the state. There's 25 plus livestock markets, many of them represented here today, and every calf ultimately ends up getting fed, whether that's a cull cow or a steer. And so being able to feed all of those cattle the best that we can, and I agree with Mike in that if we can identify the dregs and feed them differently, that's an opportunity. In that if we can identify the good cattle and feed them differently, that's an opportunity. Those opportunities don't exist when pens are 240 head in size. Those opportunities exist when they're 80, 40, smaller groups that we can put together. So I see a sorting stick and small pens as a bit of technology that we have from an opportunity standpoint. One of the things that I think to retain ownership economically, I think if we were going to go forward, you have to get paid for labor. One of the questions I like to ask people when I talk on the phone about they want to start feeding cattle, I say, well, how much are you going to charge me for yardage, or how much are you charging yourself for yardage? Many times the answer is no, I got this lot already, and I'll send you a load of cattle tomorrow. And that young people want to get paid to work. And if we want young people to be involved in agriculture, I think we have to be able to pay them for their labor, and retained ownership gives them an opportunity for that. The other thing that, as an advantage, I think we have to capture the value, that every bit of value in these systems. Cattle generate about 45 to 60 pounds of manure a day. For those of you who are in the row crop business, that's 18,520 in terms of nutrient value approximately. And so you can put whatever value you want onto that, but that's an opportunity that I'll let some of the facilities people talk about more. The biggest disadvantage I see relative to Missouri is 42 inches of rain. In that it's not cold, it's not hot, it's wet and muddy. And somehow, if we're going to retain ownership in cattle, we have to deal with the fact that cattle don't perform as well in mud, and anything that gets rained on ultimately runs to the lowest point, that being typically a water source. So controlling 42 inches of rain, I think, is something that's an advantage, grows grass, but detrimental at certain times of the year. And then the other one, from a disadvantage standpoint, is that, the joke goes that Missouri, if you don't like Missouri weather, just wait a minute and it'll change. We don't have a good cattle feeding season as it goes in the state. It's either too hot or it's too cold or it's too wet or something along those lines. And so controlling those disadvantages is how I see opportunity going forward. Last thing, and then I'll be quiet, I would suggest, as it relates to the governor's comments and that he wants to feed cattle, harvest cattle, and brand cattle in Missouri, I would suggest that we brand the end product, not the process, because the process is what gives us the advantage, that flexibility.
Good afternoon. I'm Ed Lehman from Summit Livestock Facilities. We've been building cattle barns for quite some time. We've been building farm buildings in general. Our parent company, FBI Buildings, started in 1958. FBI stood for Farm Builder Incorporated. We're real creative on our naming, but that's what we did. That's what we still do. The Summit division of FBI focuses specifically on livestock, and I'm the beef specialist, and so I focus specifically on beef and primarily on finishing beef, but we get into some backgrounding facilities and a few cow-calf ones, more and more cow-calf, as people run into problems with expensive pasture and wanting to expand and no pasture available. One plug for us, you've got a brochure in your handouts there. There's also a card in there that if you want more information from us, we do have a 3-ring binder full of all kinds of information that's from various experts like these folks, not from us. So if you are interested in any of that information and the DVD where there's various producers talk on the DVD, you can fill that out and get it to me sometime today. We'd be glad to get you that information. Justin kind of let in real good here. I ought to pay him for his nice segue when he's talking about the mud, and talking about feed efficiencies, talking about manure values. Those are all factors that we try to control when we do an indoor feedlot facility. So, when you eliminate mud from the equation, when you eliminate weather from the equation, it makes the cattle performance much more predictable. It improves feed efficiencies. I'll be really interested to see as Monty talks about some of the feed efficiencies that they're seeing here at the university and with some of the stuff they've been doing. If we can take that to the next level when it's in the right facilities, it might be even more amazing. But people always ask, well, what's it cost? And we heard the bankers up here earlier today saying, well, I don't want to loan money to a feedlot. I think that's a pretty fair interpretation of what they said, at least for a young man or a young producer. But when you do look at the numbers, the upfront cost is fairly expensive for a young producer to get into to do an indoor feedlot. But if they're going to be feeding cattle for 20 years or 30 years or 40 years, they're producing a lot of pounds of beef through that facility at a lower cost than the guy that's fighting the mud. At the same time, those manure values we were talking about earlier, again, you can plug in whatever number you want. University of Minnesota did a study where the net value of fertilizer, manure as fertilizer, I think that came out from a bedded facility at about $40 or $50 after hauling cost per acre or per cattle space, and liquid manure from a deep pit facility even more than that. So over 10 years or whatever term you want, the manure values, if you have a need for that fertilizer, the manure values are going to pay for the indoor feedlot facility at the same time that your cattle can hopefully be profitable as well. So I don't want this to be a commercial, so I'll shut up and I'll let the next person talk.
Good afternoon. I'm Kurt Beckman with the Department of Natural Resources. I just wanted to comment a little bit on the Department of Natural Resources. As you all know, we are the regulatory agency in the state of Missouri, and we would like to stay involved and know what's on the forefront. So I'm glad to be up here today and be in the crowd a little bit, so we kind of know what the industry is doing. We do support the ag industry in the state of Missouri, and we hope that the economic stability and viability can stay in the state of Missouri. Ag producers are very good stewards of our natural resources, and we want to keep that way. We do try to recognize that both regulatory and voluntary programs are complementary roles in providing agriculture producers with the ability to figure out what they're doing, to plan what their system is going to be, and we try to provide all the assistance we can. We have folks out there that are both working the permitting processes, that understand the agriculture industry. I myself am a liaison for the Department of Natural Resources, so I'm kind of that middle person, and I try to involve myself with the stakeholders as much as I can to kind of figure out where things are going, and so we can kind of see on the forefront what the needs of our agency will be, what we will need to provide, whether it's assistance and guidance as to whether or not a permit would be required. So we would like to work with stakeholders and continue to work with stakeholders. The CAFO permitting process has gone through some changes in the past 5 to 10 years. So with that, we like to work with not just the Department of Agriculture, the other agencies, but we want to work with producers. We want to work with those commodity groups, and that's a big part of what I do. We want to try to engage everyone and give them that comfort level so that they know they can come to us when they're in the planning activities of their production facility. We want them to embrace much before we get to a point where they may need a permit. So to those of producers or the industry folks that are out there, if you're thinking about expanding your facility, we want to work with you. We want to be, again, on the forefront. We want to provide that guidance. We've got folks in regional offices, 5 regional offices in the state. We have permit folks that can answer questions, can guide you through that process. We can help you decide whether or not a permit is necessary. And if it is, then we can guide you through the process to understand what the needs are, how to go about that, whether or not you'll need a construction permit, an operating permit, and so on. As I said, there's been some changes in the recent years, but in particular the beef facilities, it's pretty straightforward. The permitting process is there is guidance in your folders that we have at the department. There's information on the website, but we really want you to feel like you can call us and get assistance when you're in the planning strategy, and we want you to do that up front. So folks like myself at the department, I'm not a engineer, I'm not a permit writer, but I try to encourage landowners or other agencies. We work closely with NRCS, we work closely with the university, just to name a few, because they're the folks out there that can help with the design and the plan, and then they can follow our design guidelines. So if there's folks out there that want to contact us, feel free. We'll help you get through that. If you don't think you need a permit or don't need a permit, we can still provide assistance, and we want to provide you that assistance that you need to give you that confidence level to protect your investment and maintain the viability of agriculture.
My name's Jerry Taylor, and I'm a professor of genetics in the Division of Animal Sciences. And as you've already determined, I have a neighbor that lives in my neighborhood by the name of Norm Stewart. Some of you might know Norm. I met Norm first week that I moved to Columbia about 12 years ago. And Norm looked at me and said to me, he said, "Son," he said, "you're not from around here, are you?" And he was right. But I've been here for about 12 years now, and I work in the area of DNA. And I work with dogs and I work with cattle. And I want to start off by telling you one thing. So we heard a point this morning that I think was really, really important, and that is for the beef industry to become more successful, we need to grow the pie. And I just want to plant this seed with you. Genetic improvement grows the pie. Right? Genetic improvement of animals makes individual animals more valuable, and by making individual animals more valuable, you grow the pie. So now let me tell you a story. So I was working here in 2006, and I was working with a small group from the USDA, ARS, and another group that was in Canada. And we were developing a technology that would allow us to look at the DNA of cattle in 60,000 different places and come up with the variation. Tell us what the variation was in one assay. We could run this in one assay. We built this technology, and we did it with a company called Illumina. Illumina commercialized that technology. It's called the Bovine SNP50 assay. One of them is in the Smithsonian right now. Illumina sold $100 million worth of these chips in between the end of 2006 and about 6 months ago when they released that number to us, $100 million worth of those chips. And me and the group that developed that assay got a nice little plaque from the U.S. Secretary for Agriculture to hang on the wall to show what a great job we did to help get this technology into the beef industry. Equally, Illumina was trading for $17 when we started working with them to build this technology. And we looked at each other and we said, you know, this stuff's going to be important. We really, really should buy some Illumina stock, right? Don't worry about insider trading or anything like that. We're just a bunch of academics. We should buy some stock. We didn't. Illumina's trading today for $190 a share. So that shows how bright some of us academics are. But what it did enable us to do was two things. Number one, implement a technology called genomic selection. What's genomic selection? Genomic selection is genotype an animal at birth, genotype an embryo, and predict its genetic merit for whatever trait's important, and then release that information to the industry and implement genetic improvement. In the dairy industry, where about 3/4 of these assays have been sold, genetic improvement has increased by a factor of 7 since 2006. They're making 7 times the rate of genetic improvement that they were in 2006. And the reason for that is there's essentially one breed, Holsteins, one trait, net merit, and about 80% of all the cows are bred by AI. So the technology works perfectly within that industry. It doesn't work quite as well in the beef industry. Why? Because we have something like 80 breeds of cattle, about a dozen major breeds of cattle. Each one of these predictions needs to be developed within a breed. So the logistics are much more difficult within the beef industry. But nevertheless, what I did get out of it as an academic, and my colleagues in the Division of Animal Sciences, whom are all working on these projects, is about $10 million worth of funding from the USDA to support the development of molecular estimates of breeding value. So that is, genotype an animal and tell what its breeding value is, what its genetic merit is for traits like feed efficiency, respiratory disease, meat quality, call that marbling, and tenderness, and fertility. These are the most important traits within the beef industry. And I'm here today to tell you we can do that nicely for everything except respiratory disease, because we haven't got that project far enough advanced yet. But all of those other traits, we can estimate the genetic merit of an animal at birth for growth, feed efficiency, marbling, yield, with accuracies of about 40 to 80%, very high accuracy, certainly high enough to enable selection. Why haven't we seen a revolution within the beef industry in terms of selection for these traits? Why aren't we increasing the value of our animals dramatically as they are in the dairy industry? Well, I told you some of the reasons. There are other reasons, and that is the fact that a lot of beef cattle producers aren't motivated by profit. But in 1999, I was a professor at Texas A&M University, and two of us raised $23.5 million, and we formed a startup company, and we moved away from College Station about as fast as we could and went to Austin and tried to implement this technology at that point in time. And I learned two things from that process. Well, I learned three things at least from that process. Number one, don't do it when the NASDAQ goes from 4,800 down to 1,200. That's a really bad time to be in the biotechnology industry. But I also learned that the technology wasn't ready for prime time back then. We didn't have the tools then that we have today. The tools today are really, really powerful. And for example, we are sequencing animals now. We've sequenced 370 animals here at the University of Missouri, and that's all being used to actually develop this technology within the industry. But the most important thing I learned was that the business model was wrong. The business model of our company was to invest in taking this technology into the breed associations. And if you think about the structure of our industry, it's a pyramid, and the smallest part of that industry is the registered sector right at the top of the industry. And so that business model was wrong. Two other companies got into the technology in about 2002 and 2003. Some of you may know that. One was Merial and one was Pfizer. Both of them, I think, have now since discovered that that business model was wrong. And so where we're at is a very interesting place, I think, in the beef cattle industry. We have the technology. What we don't have is the business plan. We don't have the business model that will implement this technology within the industry. But I think Missouri is poised to actually be able to implement that technology if we can, with the help of some of our people in Ag Eco, for example, figure out what the appropriate business plan is. And I've got some ideas how that might work. One way it might work, for example, would be to get registered breeders throughout the state of Missouri and get about 10,000 cows and genotype them all. Genotype everything, predict their genetic merit for all of the traits that are important: fertility, feed efficiency, marbling score, tenderness. And the important thing that this technology does is it generates estimates of genetic merit that are have the same accuracy in females as it does in males. And that is a deal breaker. That changes the way genetic improvement operates within an industry. Because now we have the ability to genotype 10,000 cows, identify the very best cows within the population. We can identify the very best bulls. We can do superovulation and embryo transfer. We can genotype embryos. Determine which are the very best bull embryos to put back into cows to produce young bulls that we will produce semen from. So if we sell semen, we've got to figure out how to get the rate of AI up from 7% within the industry to 20 or 30%. And that's where programs like Quality Beef and the Show Me Select programs that have operated here in Missouri for about the last 10 years, Quality Beef the last 2 or 3 years, come in. These are the programs that implement fixed time AI within commercial herds to get the technology out there. Now, I haven't done the economic analysis of this business model. Scott will have it knocked out by coffee break and can tell me whether or not that'll work. But I'm here to simply say genetic improvement expands the pie. We have the technology to implement genetic improvement. What we don't have is a worked out business model that will allow us to implement that technology. I can tell you business models that don't work, and a lot of companies have spent a lot of money to find that out. What we need to do is figure out a business model that will work, invest a couple of $1 million into it, get it up and running. Thank you.
All right, let's give him a hand, please. A lot of information in a very short period of time. Very, to me, engaging information, some of it that I know we're hearing for the first time, some of us. I would like to open it up now for some questions and some thoughts and see if we can expand on some of the presentations. Over here, yes.
Paul Gibbs, this is for Mike or Dr. Curley. You've both mentioned the value of feeding cattle in Missouri, and the economists mentioned this morning that it's economically feasible to background and feed cattle. Yet we have a portion of the state that, without any scientific knowledge, is strictly politically anti-livestock in this state. What the heck do we do about that?
He didn't call your name.
Can you shut the live feed off for a second? Actually, there's people in the audience that would be better to answer that question than I would. I'd suggest things like Right to Farm. Is that a place to start, Jim? What that did? And I think that's where organizations become very important. So I'm going to dodge your question and answer a different question. Don Nickendam and I don't know how many years, Don, where you're at, but we went back and forth in discussions. We have PED and all those kind of things that swine producers deal with, and we think about how devastating that is. Yet my concern about the swine industry is what the perception or reality, whatever side of the fence you're on there, is about odor. That's what will shut down the swine industry, Monty's opinion. If you look at beef, the thing that we think about confinement feeding, I worry most about that with beef as well. And it's interesting, we don't have the luxury of hoop or fixed structures like you would for a production facility, but we do have cattle under roof and on concrete that we use for research. The thing that's interesting is if we don't keep the bedding dry, the people on the other side of 63 will tell us, you have cattle on feed over at the feedlot, don't you? And we say, no, that's somebody else. It's not us. But if we keep the bedding dry with sawdust, or we could use corn stalks or whatever, really there is no malodor that leaves the farm to speak of. So two things with that. One is the reality is we have technologies and management procedures we can implement, and we're not a nuisance. And when we do that, it's actually better for us because we keep more nitrogen, manure, and all that. The other aspect, I don't know how you fight. And my favorite story about that is there was a good-sized swine production company in North Carolina. And I guess if you have enough money, you can do these kind of things. But they built some swine grow finish barns. And I think they had 3 nuisance suits filed against them, and they never had a pig in the building. So that part, I don't have an answer how we fight, and I think we be proactive in terms of like Right to Farm and those sorts of things. But there's people far better suited than me with opinions on how to do that.
Anyone else?
I'm a university professor, so I can talk for 5 minutes and not answer a question.
There you go. Yes, you've got a question.
I'm Bob Thompson, Glen Grove Farms in Rolla. We go back a long way. I remember at the beginning of the last decade when Dr. Curley introduced the concept of RFI in Missouri when it was not known to anyone, and our best science was in Australia. Is that right? I think that was in the beginning of the last decade.
They were.
Yeah, okay. But he's put a tremendous amount of research and effort and is certainly one of the experts in the country on feed efficiency. My question is it still necessary to document and prove both rations and genetic feed efficiency in a feeding scenario, a large feedlot, for example, or has the genomic testing made that less necessary?
He's looking at you.
You periodically have to keep capturing data. So the dairy industry is basically in the best possible situation where they genotype young bulls and they genotype heifers, determine who's going to be the mother of the next group of young bulls. No other information other than genotype information. Select those animals go on to collect data, and by feeding that data back into the system, you end up with the highest accuracies and the highest rate of genetic progress. If you don't do that, you make genetic progress, but it's less. So for things like feed efficiency, we will make genetic progress, but we're not going to be feeding millions and millions of animals, into the future. We will be feeding into the future, but the number of animals will not be what it is, for example, in the dairy industry. So the bottom line is, you data are king. You always need to be collecting data.
Just to add to that bit of Bob, like if in your case with the bulls and stuff, it's hard to supplant what physical data gives you if you do the test. Now, I think your strongest position is if you know something about your bulls, then you can collect some data on calves and give them to Jerry and let Jerry see what the offspring looks like, because that's going to be the best validation on what the animal's progeny is going to be. Agree with that, Jerry? Mm-hmm. And then the best I can do, if I use some of this GrowSafe equipment I talked about, is I have to be 45 days into feeding a calf before I know what that calf's going to be able to do in the feedlot. And what my good colleague tells me is that genetics is great, but when he gets them, meaning Justin at 500 pounds, any genetic progress is gone. He has no capability to change that then. But what the other thing I think will be coming down the road is then, like what Jerry and geneticists develop, is I get those calves in and I can test those calves and I can make some assessment on what that calf's going to do then when it goes in the feedlot, and that tells me then how to feed that calf. If this drives Jerry crazy, but what we like to do is we like to categorize animals in efficiency as inefficient, average, and inefficient, average, and efficient. And by how I put that diet together, I can make the inefficient calf as efficient as the average calf, and the average calf as efficient as the efficient calf. I have to feed a different diet. The diet gets more expensive, but depending on where that calf is genetically, and what I like to call metabolic efficiency, I can feed that calf and change its feed to gain. Now, if I have a test to be able to do that, then that's what I want to know. I'm going to be very careful when I buy cattle from Justin Angel, because he's going to keep all the efficient ones for himself. That's a joke. That's just a joke. Does that make sense, Bob?
All right. More questions? Yes.
Thank you. I'm Warren Love, currently a beef producer in St. Clair County and also serve as a state legislature. But for 20 years, I operated and maintained a livestock feed business and got the opportunity to sell a fairly large feed yard. It was in western Missouri, known as GM Feed Yard there at Appleton City. We fed about 4,000 to 5,000 head of cattle. My concern is probably to our representative from DNR, Kurt. What assurance does a cattle feeder have that if they become compliant with the guidelines currently, that's by the state DNR, that if they put in a facility, that they can't be ruled and regulated or zoned out by local county ordinance 192-300? We know for a fact that there's about 16 counties in the state of Missouri that has allowed that to happen, or that has happened over the past 10 to 15 years. And I think if we're going to go forward in the cattle industry and encourage farm feeders, we need to have some kind of assurance that that won't happen, and how's the best way to prevent that from happening?
Yeah, really with the county and ordinances in different parts of the state, I understand there are different ordinances and planning and zoning restrictions that each individual probably needs to consider. To be in compliance with what regulations the department addresses, as I said before, it's pretty specific to the beef industry. If you have over 1,000 animal units, then you would be required to get a Class 1 permit. 1,000 animal units for beef is basically 1-to-1. So if you have over 1,000 animal units confined for 45 or more days in a situation, whether it's open feedlot or in a barn, in a 12-month period, so 45 days, 12-month period, 1,000 animal units, then you would have to get a Class 1 permit. That is basically the main guideline for a permit for beef industry. Those local planning and zoning, each county, obviously, as you know, or even community has the ability to have those restrictions. They can be more restrictive than what state regulations are. But the department is supportive of what we regulate, and we would like to, for landowners, for entities, to make sure that what we have there is less than 1,000 animal units. If you have less than 1,000 animal units, then there is a Class 2 permit, but it's not required. But the department does have the ability to request an entity to obtain a Class 2 permit. But the main thing is to remember that 1,000 animal units. That's the permit that we generally will be issuing, that we do with other types of livestock. The planning and zoning for within different counties is obviously up to those county individuals.
All right. One of the things I wanted to mention before the next question is we did have another panelist today, Brent Bryant, who's not here, but the information about hoop beef systems are also in your packet. So more questions? You got one back there?
Richard Thomas from Suburban Moberly. I had a question for Dr. Taylor about the trait assessment, measurement, et cetera. It seemed like you were following breed direction rather than a hybrid kind of a thing that the pork industry has done.
Yeah, that was pretty astute. And the reason for that is that the technology right now works on a breed-by-breed basis. So if I want to predict the genetic merit of an animal for feed efficiency, the technology that we are currently using says I've got to do that within Hereford cattle and do it separately within Angus cattle, do it separately within Simmentals. And it's a limitation that I think we will be able to overcome in the next couple of years because we're using a technology that really knows nothing about where in the genome the genes are that directly affect these traits, right? We're simply using a 50,000 shotgun through a sheet sort of approach to be able to do that. And it works within breeds, but not across breeds. That's why we're currently sequencing lots and lots of animals so that we can drill down to build assays that just assay for the things that directly cause variation within the trait. It's technical, but that's as close as I can come. Sorry.
More questions? Yes. Got right here in the center.
Matt Hardicke, I'm a cattle producer and banker who does enjoy financing feeder cattle. Kurt, the question is, I know you mentioned 1,000 head capacity, but several of our neighboring states, especially to our east, have more adopted the 300 unit animal as far as permitting. Do you see that coming down the pike in Missouri, or what's your thoughts? And it was a great question, is if a producer is going to build one of Ed's barn, should they be preparing for that 300 animal unit?
Well, I can't really say as to whether or not those regulations, I don't know. My crystal ball doesn't show whether or not, the legislative, the General Assembly, nor the Clean Water Commission would want to go down to 300 animal units. recently. I think in the last 5 years, those animal units were reconfigured. But at this point, currently what regulation is those 1,000 animal units. I know the state of Iowa also has, they've had a lot of open feedlots that have been surfacing, and I think just learning from what they've gone through, we want to be, again, on the forefront. We want to know what's coming. If these open feedlots are going to start increasing their numbers, then we want to work with those landowners. We want to give them every opportunity to plan what they need to know. Again, I don't have my crystal ball. I don't know if it'll do it with 300 animal units. It may go up, but that's up to the lawmakers in the state of Missouri, and the Clean Water Commission also makes those state regulations from the statute that comes from General Assembly. So, at this point, that's what it is. It's 1,000 animal units. So we're gonna maintain what we have. We're gonna continue to work with folks, assuming that we have those numbers.
All right. More questions? Yes.
Ashley McDonald, Missouri Farm Bureau. And Kurt, this is again for you, kind of a same topic. EPA oversight, so federal oversight, seems to come with increased small feedlots, especially beef feedlots, kind of like what they're dealing with in Iowa. Would you expect EPA and Region 7 to increase their oversight on your agency? And is that something that you worry about or cattle producers should worry about?
Sure. We recognize that, again, in Iowa, EPA, I think, did start taking a look at some of those open feedlots. And they did maybe increase a little bit of the pressure on the state agency, the regulatory agency there. I don't know what will happen in Missouri if we continue to do that, but what we want to focus on, even if it's not a permanent facility, is we want to educate and try to get those landowners to understand how important waste management is. And that's really what that permit is to do, is to give guidelines to help them understand if they're land applying, that they need to do agronomic rates, they need to apply to agronomic rates, how to manage their waste, even if they're not a permitted facility. That is what we really want to focus on, because we're trying to protect the natural resources in the state. EPA does have the ability to go and inspect. Generally, they will, I think, notify the department. And when it gets into the regulatory part, I've got staff that can probably answer those questions better than I can. But I think if we can continue to involve our stakeholders in the regulatory process, which I think we've done pretty well. The stakeholders are there. A lot of folks in the room today I know are familiar faces. They come and they provide us input. The commodity groups, farm bureaus, those folks we're embraced with those. We engage with them on a regular basis, and we ask that you provide that input that we need to keep these regulations where they need to be. The regulatory agencies and the regulations and production and agriculture are not necessarily opposing forces. As was mentioned earlier, I think some of the the regulations are things that we need, and that's some of the things that keep those producers to where they are that marginal cost, marginal return, how to apply the waste the way it should be. That's what we want to focus on.
Thanks, Kurt. Other questions? Yep.
So from the perspective of DNR, if we have Missouri producers that are in compliance with everything you ask them to do, then why do they have to still worry about being sued for nuisance and other actions?
Well, that's a good question. There are regulations, and we talk about 1,000 animal units, but and I may have to get some help from some of the folks that I brought with me today. But if you are getting a permit, or if you are applying for a permit, then you have to do neighbor notifications, and that has to be open for 30 days. That's a requirement if you're going to obtain a permit, and that's just something that the department does require. After that 30 days, if the neighbor notices, and the Department of Natural Resources does keep track of those, after that 30 days, we have the option to, by authority of the Clean Water Commission, to issue that permit or not issue that permit, depending on the neighbor notice. Very unlikely. I don't think it happens very often. And I may ask staff to join in if they have any additional requirements or anything else to say. But generally, after that 30 days, that permit is issued, and the department has the ability to do that. Again, it gets a little bit to. I know there's odor issues, but the neighbor, there's those buffer distances that the neighbor notices. That's where it goes. Those buffer distances are set. That you have to notify them if you are going to build a CAFO within that certain range. That's what we offer in the permitting process. Those folks that are not permitted still have the, as a landowner, you still have the responsibility to maintain your system to where you're not polluting waters of the state. And if you're not a permitted facility, then that's something that, as a good steward of the land, that you have to continue to do.
All right. More questions? DNR is getting the brunt of this, right? Yes. Back over here in this corner.
John Clybaker from Stott City. And I have to say, I sure enjoyed my lunch take today. I hope you all did. My question to the panel is, from what I've learned and understood, tenderness is the thing that consumers tell us is their number one driver in determining whether they've had a good beef eating experience or not. And so what I'm curious about is, how do I breed for it? How do I feed for it? And what do you know about efforts that are underway such that we can measure it at the speed of commerce, so that, most importantly to me, I can get paid for it?
Take your time answering that. I know it's not me, Marks.
Everybody's looking at each other.
I'm telling these guys to take their time answering this question.
First, right, Jerry? Breed?
Yeah, we can breed for it. You may or may not recall that about 1998, the National Cattlemen's Beef Association actually sponsored a project to generate thousands of animals from about 10 different breeds that they collected steaks from and did Warner Bachelor shear forces on them. We have about 5,000 of those animals from about 6 or 7 different breeds here at the University of Missouri. We've genotyped them. Jared Decker, who's sitting at the table over there, is actually working with those data and has developed prediction equations that allow us to predict genetic merit of animals for shear force. We can do that right now, but as you point out, nobody's going to pay for those estimates of genetic merit for shear force if they're not getting paid for them. Moreover, tenderness is more of a problem for some breeds than others. If you happen to be an Angus breeder, for example, they don't tend to have a lot of problems for shear force, and about 70% of our cow herd here in Missouri is Angus-based. So you could argue that if you come from Texas, where there's a lot of Indocene cattle within the populations down there, it ought to be something you should be focusing on a lot more than people from this part of the world.
I think John, the other part of that too is length, or how old those cattle are when they're harvested. If if you're getting an animal that's 26 months of age when you harvest it, good chance you'll be chewing. If that calf's 13 months old when you harvest it, I would say it's very infrequently. And Brian, you can chime in on that if I'm wrong. But the younger you get that calf, just your chances of toughness goes way down. And I think what we're talking about, quality animals, that one of the things that the upper two-thirds choice or higher almost guarantees is somewhat age of that carcass. I mean, that calf was fed and taken care of and harvested before it was a lot of times too advanced in age, and I think that's where some of the brand CB and what have you have reduced tenderness is because of age on feed. But from a nutritional standpoint, my thought is it's set by genetics, but what I can do from nutrition is I can feed the calf to harvest quality beef.
All right, let's give everyone a hand again. Thank you. We are going to take a quick break. My clock says 2:17. We'd like to start back at 2:30.